So this chapter is going to deal with cellular metabolism. So we're going to talk about the different energy processes that help make the ATP that we need for our cells and how it is that we do that. So remember that foods are what provide the fuel for our body. And when we do this, we use a chemical process called oxidation. And what that means is that you're using oxygen in order to make the amount of ATP, the maximum amount of ATP that our body's going to use. We also have an anaerobic process that does not use oxygen. It's called anaerobic metabolism. And we do make ATP from that, but it's very, very small. So we'll be focusing primarily on how it is that the process goes through and how much ATP goes from each one of these. Our food, in terms of how much value there is in it, has to do with the kilocalories. So how many calories do you get for each of the nutrients? We've got carbs, we've got proteins, and we've got fats. So we'll be talking about that. So major nutrients, remember, are the carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And I also include water in here because we have to have water in order for us to be able to carry out metabolic processes. And then the minor nutrients, the vitamins and minerals, are very important for different chemical reactions that our body has. When you look at the carbs, you're looking at sugars or starches or complex carbs, and these come primarily from fruits, vegetables, obviously from some grains, and then we do have some stored glycogen in meat, but you're not going to get a significant amount of sugar from a meat product. That is where you're going to get mostly your protein. Incomplete proteins just mean that they don't have all the essential amino acids that our body needs. We actually need 20 amino acids in order to function, and 8 of those amino acids we must get from our foods, and those are going to be found primarily in animal proteins, but you can combine different plant-based products to be able to get a complete protein. Lipids are fats, so we're going to have our saturated fat, which means that all the bonds, all the hydrogen bonds are there. If they're unsaturated, it means that it doesn't have all the hydrogen bonds with it, but and it's going to be more liquid at room temperature. Kind of talked about this earlier. And then cholesterol, remember, is a very important product that we need in order for our cell membranes to function properly, but we also need it in order to be able to make steroid hormones. And we get cholesterol from saturated fats that come from eggs, from meats, and then from some of the dairy products. So our 5 basic food groups, I think you've seen this before, probably in elementary school where they first started teaching all this. So these little tables, they just go through and they tell you, obviously, what the food group is, what you get from it, and then the particular things that our body would use from that. And then obviously our milk and our meat products. And our meat alternatives, obviously, too, fish is included in that. We also get complete protein from that. So vitamins function as coenzymes. So what they do is they actually help metabolic reactions take place. We get these from our fruits and vegetables. And then our minerals are also important for enzyme activity, and we're going to get these from vegetables, from some meats, from some of the legumes that we consume. So it's important to have a varied diet that includes all of these different foods. Our metabolism, this involves the biochemical reaction that is going to be taking place within our cells. Catabolism, remember from the chemistry chapter, is when we break things down. So we're actually releasing ATP, or releasing the energy to be able to make the ATP. So we'll go through and talk about how that works. And then anabolism is when we're making actual larger molecules from smaller ones. So this is when we're actually going to be storing energy. So catabolism and anabolism are continuously taking place in our body. The 3 types of pathways that our body goes through to make this ATP are glycolysis, what we call the Krebs cycle, and then the last piece is called the electron transport chain. So as a whole, the first one, glycolysis, this is your anaerobic metabolism. They call it cellular respiration because of the process of what eventually ends up taking place with what we're going to do with oxygen. But I want you to remember that glycolysis is anaerobic. The byproduct of anaerobic metabolism, if you don't bring oxygen into the mix, is going to be lactic acid. What we yield from glycolysis is only 2 ATP, and that is not a whole lot of ATP for our cells to be able to carry on and continue with life. So what you're going to be doing if you stay in a glycolytic pathway is you will continue to make lactic acid, and then the body will eventually become too acidic. The tissue won't be able to continue doing its job because you are not making enough ATP for it to continue. In order for it to keep going and be able to make the energy that it needs, you now need to enter this stuff that's called pyruvic acid. It needs to be converted from pyruvate into acetyl-CoA, which is a process, some steps in between there, that will then enter into the Krebs cycle. And what we yield from here, and this actually takes place in the mitochondria, will be carbon dioxide and water. From there, some of these protons that we make, or these hydrogens that we make, are going to enter into this thing called the electron transport chain. And this is where we're going to make the majority of our ATP. So the production of hydrogen that takes place from what occurs in the Krebs cycle is extremely important for what we then need to take place in that electron transport chain. Now, for the purposes of our job and what we're going to be doing as paramedics, you don't need to know every single little detail of what happens in glycolysis or the Krebs cycle. If you do want to know more about that, you can certainly take a biochemistry course or look into a more advanced A&P book that will go through and really go into the details of how this all works. But for what we're doing, I just want to make sure that you understand that the pathways that are going to be making the ATP are going to be glycolysis, which is anaerobic, and you yield 2 ATP, and then aerobic pathway that includes the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, and that is what's going to yield the most ATP, anywhere between the range 28, 32, or to 38. And that all has to do with what fuel source you ended up using. So what I mean by that is when you have your cell, and this is just a little zoomed in view of what occurs, glycolysis actually happens in the cytoplasm, the fluid portion of the cell that is outside of this unit that is the mitochondria, where we actually have the aerobic metabolism that takes place. And so your body will go through, think of this as gears that you're going through in your car. When you first get going, right, you're going to be like first and second gear, and then your car will transfer into like third, fourth, and eventually fifth or sixth gear, depending on what kind of car you have. And in order to be able to continue and keep going, you have to have a very efficient gear pathway, which is why you want to get into the higher gears that are going to be much more efficient in terms of the fuel that you're going to end up using. So glycolysis, you can sustain a metabolic process through that for about 40 to 60 seconds or so. But then once you're going to go beyond that in terms of the energy that your cell needs, in terms of like, think of it as when you're working out, if you're going to keep going, you want to keep running, and you want to run 2 miles, right, or 5 miles, your body has to kick into aerobic metabolism to make sure you make enough ATP. But if all you're doing is sprinting once around the track, or you're doing a high intensity, circuit, and it's going to last about a minute, that's when you're going to be mostly in that glycolytic pathway. And then what you're going to feel from that, because of the intensity that you're working, is the lactic acid that ends up building up. Once you slow down and now you start bringing oxygen into the mix, now we're able to move into the aerobic metabolism portion and then be able to keep going. So how it works in terms of our body, when we're in glycolysis, we're pretty much in this middle section. So we're using glucose primarily for energy. You're going to go through, there are a number of different enzymes, and there's a whole bunch of little steps that happen in between here. But ultimately what happens from glycolysis is we're going to end up making this stuff called pyruvate, or what they call pyruvic acid. All right? Our body, if we continue in that glycolytic pathway where we're still in that high intensity, it will then end up making lactic acid. Eventually your body will say, hey, you need to stop. You can't keep going. And what it's telling you is, I can't make more energy. So what you do is you slow down, then you'll have that aerobic component kick in. We make this stuff from pyruvate called acetyl-CoA. From here we kick in to the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, and then from that is where we then make these little protons, basically hydrogen ions, to then transport the electrons that get released from here into this thing called the electron transport chain, and then we make more of the ATP. What I also wanted you to see on this slide is that you don't just need carbohydrate for energy. We can use fat and we can use protein, but the preferred method for our body and for our cells to use for energy is going to be glucose, which is carbs. What our body can do is it can take fat and it can take part of the molecules. So back in the chemistry chapter, I showed you what a triglyceride looked like. And the little carbon skeleton, we can actually take that and use that carbon skeleton that is called glycerol and plug it in to this glycolytic pathway, and then plug it in here, and then eventually we will kick in and start using the citric acid cycle. If we're not doing that and we want to use more of the actual molecule, the fatty acid portion, we'll cleave that off in through beta oxidation, which is another process that is used for metabolizing fat. Now we plug that portion of those molecules into the acetyl-CoA and then kick that through. From here, we will then generate ketones, and these ketones our brain can actually use to make ATP. Not the preferred method, but it can do that if you're going to resort to that. With amino acids, what we do there is we remove the amine, the NH2, and then it'll eventually make ammonia. Our body will then put that into and make urea, and then eventually we end up peeing some of that out. But part of what happens from the deamination, removing the amine, is that acidic portion. We will take that keto acid and we can plug it into the pyruvic, or we can plug it in to the acetyl-CoA. So we can take part of that carbon and work it in to the Krebs cycle and then plug it in here at the level of the acetyl-CoA, and then it'll continue, and then we can use that to keep making our energy. So our body will use the best pathway it needs at that moment in order to generate the most energy with the least amount of energy spent. And so our bodies are lazy. They don't want to expend more energy than they absolutely need to. And so that is why they will kick in and they can use these other resources for energy. So for example, if you're doing a keto diet, right? Keto diets are very, very low in carbohydrate. What you're doing is essentially right here, right? You're in this keto. So what you're doing is you're utilizing protein and fat, the carbon portion of it, primarily for kicking into this acetyl-CoA and then running it through and doing aerobic metabolism that way. Over time, you can't sustain that for the rest of your life. It is very, very difficult. It works very well short term for what you're trying to do is to cut weight. Works great for that. Part of the success from it is also because the amount of calories that you're eating are much less. But eventually your body is going to need those carbs again. So that is my big caution in terms of keto diets or the high-fat diets that really break down and reduce the carbohydrates. And of course, with diabetics, it's completely different in terms of why, obviously they can't have high levels of glucose because their body doesn't metabolize it properly. So then in their situation, then we're having to really manage diet by having lower carb diets. And then obviously in some cases, insulin has to play a role. So this is kind of how it breaks down in terms of how it works it. So here's your carb pathway, here's your fat pathway, and then here's our protein pathway. In the end, if what we're going to do is aerobic metabolism, remember it all has to plug into this chemical called acetyl-CoA, and then this acetyl-CoA will kick on, will go through the Krebs cycle, and then that will eventually generate the electrons that we need to get into the electron transport chain. Again, for our purposes, we don't have to go into all the little details of the biochemistry, but I do want you to understand that each of these is going to generate energy, but to generate the most ATP, that is when we need to kick on and use oxygen for that. So, carbohydrate metabolism, okay? Glucose is going to be oxidized, so we bring oxygen in. Part of the byproduct from this eventually will be carbon dioxide and water. This is what happens in the Krebs cycle, and then ultimately we will make the ATP, which is what we get from glycolysis, the first step over here, and then in the end from the electron transport chain. So bottom line is we need to have this ATP, and in order for cells to keep going, remember our brains and our hearts are the two things, our brain and heart absolutely have to have enough oxygen and enough energy to keep going. So they are highly dependent on carbohydrates and oxygen, namely glucose. When someone has a state of hyperglycemia, that means high blood glucose. So normally, if you have excess glucose, your body will store that as glycogen, or it'll then convert it into fat and store it in fat cells, right? Same things can happen with protein. Their body can convert protein into fat, right? Fat obviously can be stored as fat. But when you see the word hyper means more. Glycemia means that you now have high sugar, in the blood. Emia is the ending for something that is in the blood itself. So hyperglycemia means the blood has high blood glucose. Hypoglycemia, hypo means low, there's glyce means the glucose, emia in the blood. So this is low levels of glucose. Here with glycogen, glycogen, remember, is a complex carbohydrate that is stored in our liver, and we also store it in muscle. So what happens when you have glycogenolysis? Lysis means to break down. So we are breaking down glycogen, namely where we break this down is in the liver, put that glucose into our blood, and it helps bring our blood glucose levels up when we're in a hypoglycemic state. So our body is saying, hey, we need more glucose. Very easily you can target the liver and get that. And there is a hormone called glucagon that is what is released from the pancreas to then go to the liver and break down the glycogen. The word gluconeogenesis, now we're talking about making glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. So now what happens here, for example, is when we're kicking in the glycerol carbon skeleton from a triglyceride and plugging it in to the cycle where we would now have the glycolytic pathway. And so that is one of the places where we are now able to do that and generate from non-carbohydrate sources. Same thing, we can take that carbon from proteins and plug it in and do gluconeogenesis from that. So our body will perform gluconeogenesis when it says, hey, your blood sugar is low, we need to make more glucose. And so it'll start tapping into non-carbohydrate sources, fat and protein, skeletal muscle primarily, fat, the fat that is stored in our fat cells, and start making more of that glucose. When amino acids are oxidized, again, you're going to make ketones from this. You'll go through a ketotic pathway, but you also end up making ammonia. This ammonia that is made happens because you remove that amine portion of the amino acid molecule, and that is then transported to the liver. Our body helps detoxify that, and then we form a substance called urea, which primarily we end up excreting in the urine. So this ammonium ion that we form when this takes place, this whole process, and then is transported to the kidney, we end up excreting in the urine. With the fat, remember, fat has various functions in our body, namely one is to provide the energy that we need, but it also helps us with insulation, protecting our organs, and also very important in terms of our cell membrane structure and the myelin sheath that is really important to protect a part of the neuron in our brains and within our spinal cords and the nerves that run out from our spinal cords into our muscles, into our organs. They have to have myelin. So myelin is a very important substance that we need fat for. So that's why when you go on these zero fat diets, it can actually end up affecting your cell membrane structure and in some cases the myelin. So with fat metabolism, the byproduct from that is going to be ketones. Ketones can be used for energy, but part of the problem is that we make this acidic type pathway where you end up in what can be ketoacidosis. And part of the problem with this, and where it's best exemplified, is going to be in people who are type 1 diabetics. When their blood sugar gets really high, it's because that sugar has not been able to be absorbed into the cell because they do not have insulin to be able to facilitate the transport of the glucose into the cells. So the sugar stays high. The cells say, hey, I'm not getting any carbs. So then they start resorting to fat for energy, and the byproduct from that is going to be the ketones. But the acid that is released from that, the hydrogen ion, part of the problem is that then that starts causing the blood to become very acidic. And so that's how you go into this ketoacidosis. So earlier when I talked about metabolic acidosis, this is what we're talking about. So you can get metabolic acidosis from ketoacidosis when the body is not able to use carbohydrate as the fuel source, and then you get this acidotic pH that occurs in the blood. Then the liver is very, very important. I wanted to talk about this one here because of its role in digestion, detoxification of drugs and alcohol, hormone production, but it also produces cholesterol, which is absolutely critical for what we need in our cell membrane structure, and then also in our hormones that are sex steroids. And then we also produce from the liver a very important protein called albumin that helps maintain our fluid balance between our blood and our tissues. And then this is also where you're going to make the clotting proteins for blood clotting. So it's a very, very important organ. Then in terms of maintaining glucose homeostasis, so remember homeostasis refers to balance. When you see the word glycogenesis, that means that you are making glycogen, and this happens when glucose molecules start bonding together, and they make these very long glycogen molecules and are primarily stored in the liver, but we also store it in our skeletal muscle and in our heart. Glycogenolysis, this is the breakdown of glycogen, so this is when you're breaking the glycogen molecule into the glucose, and then that goes into the blood and helps raise our blood sugar. So for example, when you go into a sympathetic state of fight or flight, our body will target the liver to break down the glycogen and help increase our blood sugar to have instant energy. Gluconeogenesis, this is the formation of new sugars, as I talked about earlier, to produce more fats and proteins. You'll see a lot of these little seesaws in a number of the different lectures that we're going to be having, but I like these because they're kind of an image, pictures that you can actually see, hey, how's our body going to do something? So up here, when you're stimulus, remember, everything happens based on cause and effect in the body. So if your blood glucose levels are increasing, your body's going to say, hey, we need to bring this glucose into the cells. So one of the things that our body will do is with the liver, it'll take some of that glucose and start converting it into glycogen and then keep it there. Now, if for some reason our blood glucose levels fall, then our body will say, hey, we can target this liver to break down the glycogen, go through that glycogenolytic pathway, and dump the glucose into the blood, and then that helps raise our blood sugar. We can also go through gluconeogenesis, which will then help by using amino acids and fats to make glucose-like molecules and then help also increase our glucose levels. So fats and fatty acids, remember, very important. We get a lot of energy from these. We can oxidize them to provide energy as needed. We also need our liver to help with producing the blood proteins and for albumin and clotting proteins. And then it's also very important in terms of detoxification of any kind of ammonia or amines that will produce the ammonia and then ammonium ions. So very, very important in terms of doing that. Then our cholesterol, remember that we need cholesterol for metabolism and transport. It's not used to make ATP, but it's very important in terms of some of the hormones that are going to be used for that. And also the structural integrity of our membranes, steroid hormones, and the vitamin D. So the majority of it is going to be produced in the liver. We do get some cholesterol from our diet. And then in terms of energy intake, our body likes to be in balance. Remember, the term for that is homeostasis. So we need to take in enough energy based on the balance of what we're putting out. If energy intake and energy output are equal, we're just going to stay at the same weight, basically. But if your energy intake exceeds your output, then your body's going to start storing. So its favorite way to store it is going to be as fat. If you're doing more energy output than energy intake, then your body's going to start using more of the stored energy, namely in fat, and then your body be able to metabolize that and provide the energy that you need. So, but that's pretty much how your energy needs are balanced based on what comes in and what goes out. So things that can interfere with this energy balance, as you know, would be obesity, or obviously that's going to be significant weight gain, storing fat. If for some reason you are not consuming enough of a particular food to get the right nutrition that you need, you could actually lose weight from that. Any kind of real stressful type activity or thing that happens in life can also cause this, because sometimes people don't want to eat from being really, really stressed out, and then your body will actually start metabolizing protein, so namely your skeletal muscle, so you can go into a muscle wasting state. So it's really important to always try and keep that energy balance equation. The regulation of your food intake is regulated by your center in your hypothalamus, which is part of your brain that helps regulate your energy intake and output. From there, that is where your body will say, hey, you need to eat, or hey, you're full, so it kind of helps regulate that. But a lot of what is taking place and the mechanisms that occur have to do with what is taking place in our blood, what hormones are produced, what is our body temperature, and then again it ties back to psychological factors such as our stress levels. In terms of how many calories are found in these particular units of nutrient, our carbohydrates and our proteins provide 4 calories or 4 kcals per gram. fats provide 9. So you can see that fats actually provide a little bit more than double the energy than carbohydrates and proteins do. So this is one of the reasons why when you're doing cardiovascular exercise, you go into an aerobic type activity, your body will actually shift more into fat metabolism because it gets more energy from that and is able then from this fat energy, these kcals that are stored, to then be able to make more ATP, just because it's able to get more of that energy from the fat. Then we have this thing that's called your basic metabolic rate. So your basal metabolism is basically what you need to survive, right, to live. It's not what you need to work out. It's not what you need to do all these extra activities other than what if you were just in a perfect state of calm, right, not doing anything extra. Think of it as being a couch potato on a Sunday watching football all day, right? You're not going to be expending a lot of energy doing that. But now you get into the academy, you're going to be burning a lot of calories there. Your body is going to need a lot more, and because of the amount of muscle mass that you're probably going to put on in some cases, your basal metabolic rate could actually increase a little bit. So as a whole, they have determined that basal metabolic rate runs anywhere between 60 to 72 calories per hour on average for somebody who weighs about 154 pounds, right? So that's just an estimate, all right? There are going to be other things that are going to vary based on, the amount of muscle mass, obviously energy intake. All these things also play into basal metabolic rate, but everybody has the base metabolism. On average, for women, it's around 1,200 calories a day. For men, around 1,500. Many people do not consume even that much. They think that they need to starve themselves to lose weight, and actually you need to eat to lose. I think a lot of you already know that. But then if you're trying to increase muscle mass, it's also very important that you're also increasing the amount of calories that you're eating, because your body is going to need more energy in order to be able to increase and build more of that muscle. So it's very important to make sure that you're getting enough of the nutrients. So things that are going to determine basal metabolic rate: surface area, right? So like kids, for example, have very high metabolic rates because smaller bodies are usually going to have higher metabolic rates. Males as a whole tend to have higher metabolic rates just because as a whole males tend to have more muscle mass. And then when you're growing, when you're a child and an adolescent, especially when you're going through puberty, that is when the metabolic rate is going to be at its highest, because that is when you're going to have the highest amount of thyroid hormone, growth hormone, and the sex steroids, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, depending on your sex, circulating through your system. So you're going to be in a very highly metabolic state. Thyroid hormone, or what's called thyroxine, is the metabolic hormone. And so it's a very, very important energy balance hormone. Virtually every cell in our body has receptors for thyroid hormone, and this is what dictates how quickly glucose is going to be oxidized. So individuals who don't produce enough thyroid hormone are going to have a lower metabolic rate, and that is actually one of the symptoms that happens when people start going into what's called hypothyroidism, or a slow thyroid production. They'll experience weight gain. And so that'll be one of the things that they start to notice. They'll also experience that they're cold, right? Because when you're cold, your body is not producing enough heat, right? So this is why one of the symptoms is for people that have hypothyroid is to feel cold. And then in terms of the brain, it's going to feel foggy, right? You're not going to be quite as sharp because the metabolic process to help with that brain processing and the different reactions are going to be slowed down because you don't have enough thyroid hormone. So very, very important to make sure that you have enough thyroid. Then body temperature regulation, very important. So anytime that you eat, your body actually is going to have this thing that's called thermic effective heating. So when you eat, right, your body is actually going to produce heat from the different metabolic processes that it's going through. This is why sometimes when people eat, they actually feel warm. The normal body temperature as a whole is on average 96, 97 degrees Fahrenheit to around 100. Or if you want to look at it in Celsius, 35.6 to 37.8. That is about normal for our homeostatic temperature. When we go out of these boundaries of what is normal, that is when our body is going to make some decisions in terms of, do we need to cool you or do we need to warm you up? And a lot of it has to do with where is the blood going. Remember that the things that matter the most are in our core. So our heart, our brain, kidneys, and the gut. So those things, blood, when you're cold, it's going to be shunted inward. So it's going to be taken more from the skin and shunted in so that you can preserve more of the organs that are absolutely critical for survival. If you get really warm, now what your body will do is it'll actually shunt blood out more to the skin to help dissipate some of that heat through the body surface and also trigger the sweating mechanism to help you cool off. Now when someone goes into a hypothermic, so remember hypo is low and then therm is going to refer to temperature. When you're very, very cold, what's going to start happening is that respiratory rate, blood pressure, heart rate, and your consciousness will gradually start to decrease. Initially, your body will try to warm you up, but if you continue to get cold and stay in the cold environment, the body is then going to start conserving energy. And so it's going to gradually start progressing and cooling you to eventually where you can end up in a coma or eventually die. Because now your body is in such a low metabolic state that you are not producing enough of the ATP that you need in order to carry on regular survival. With hyperthermia, now your body is exposed to heat for too long, or when you have very, very high fevers. So now what happens here is that the metabolic rate significantly increases because now what it's trying to do is to cool you off. Sweating goes up, and also this can lead to dehydration. What can also happen, and the big danger from this, is when you get into a positive feedback where now your body is just getting hotter and hotter and hotter. It's not able to cool you off. So the regulatory mechanism is no longer working. Now you're going to have enzymes and proteins and different biochemical reactions that can't function because you are too hot. And here in Arizona, we see a lot of these hyperthermic emergencies during the summertime. We don't see hypothermia as much, but it can happen because there are individuals, obviously, that can be exposed to very cold temperatures, even here in the desert when it's very cold. So you can become hypothermic even in the summer if you're in a pool, if you're in a river, in a lake, and continuously exposed to that, because now your body's going to dissipate heat out. Obviously, those bodies of water tend to be cooler than what the environment is on the outside, and then obviously what's in the body. So you can become hypothermic in the summer as well. So in terms of how our body regulates the temperature, here's our little seesaw. So if your body temperature is going up, it's going to kick on within your hypothalamic center. This is where the hypothalamus is located in the brain, and it'll trigger the mechanism for you to start cooling. So it'll trigger sweat glands and also cause more blood to be shunted to the skin to help dissipate heat through evaporation that way and then radiate some of the heat out. If you get very, very cold, then your body will do the opposite and then start retaining heat. So it'll actually draw blood from the skin toward the core, and initially your body will start shivering, so it will cause this involuntary muscle contraction to start occurring in the skeletal muscle to help warm you up. But if that doesn't work, then you will continue going downhill and you can eventually die. If it does work, then gradually, obviously, body temperature will start to increase, and then we want the body temperature to return back to normal, and then it's back at homeostasis. So these are just some of the metabolic processes, obviously, that happen in the body. So the big main things from this chapter, make sure you know how much ATP is made from each of the basic metabolic pathways. So glycolysis, remember you get 2 ATP primarily from that. And from your aerobic metabolism, that is going to be your Krebs cycle electron transport chain. That is going to be your anywhere between 28 to 38, depending on what fuel source is actually being used. If you have any questions, again, please get in touch with me and I'll be happy to answer them.